So the focus of this conference is justice, as you know, and our book is about justice in Catholic higher education. My role is really quick, and it's to introduce the book and to lay the ground for several of its contributors, our panelists at this session. So, there we go. Very quickly, the book has a twofold origin, and this is one part in the Catholic Social Thought Learning and Research Initiative, CST-LRI, which has been around since, I think, 2014. There are people here who can correct me, but around that. Here are some number of the members of that group. I think this is from 2019, though it might be from 2017. So, group's still alive. We work on topics in Catholic social thought. If you're interested in Catholic social thought and collaborating, that's the key to this group, then we welcome your participation, and we could talk about that later. In 2018, we published an issue of the Journal of Catholic Higher Education, and that's a precursor for this book that Jennifer and I put together. Slide 2, Marguerite is not here. She's with Peter Walsh, in fact. In 2018, my colleague in economics at King's College, Margarita Rose, and I ran a faculty staff faculty workshop, faculty staff workshop, development workshop on Catholic higher education in light of Catholic social thought. And one discovery that we made was that at that time it was difficult to find material that worked really well for our purposes. So that was another impetus for this project. There is other good material. There's Jerry Byers' recent book, Just Universities. But Jerry's book is really big, and ours is not nearly so big. And ours, too, consists of a number of chapters that can be read independently of one another. For our staff faculty development workshop, we focused, though not exclusively, on what we call the hidden curriculum of our institutions. I've got some examples there. So we educate our students in all kinds of ways, and one of the ways in which we educate our students is by how our institutions operate. And that's also a way that we educate our employees, staff and faculty. So that was the focus of our workshop, and it's likewise a focus, though again, not an exclusive focus of the book. Okay, so the goal of the book is, as it says there, to stimulate, structure, and support discussion of contemporary challenges in Catholic higher education in light of Catholic social thought. Beginning in January 2020, Jennifer, Reed-Bouley, I, and our contributors went to work to produce this book, which consists of 10 chapters, could well be difficult to read, plus a preface by Cardinal Michael Czerny and an introduction by the editors. And maybe here you can see a little better. So some excellent contributors who put a lot of time into producing these chapters. Each chapter ends with questions for consideration and discussion framed by the editors. Oh. Not sure what happened there. All right. So last from me. So in terms of audiences, this is a resource for college and university administrators, faculty, staff, and boards of trustees. I think our publisher was really interested in this book because it has an audience. It's not a huge audience. It's not as big as the audience at that baseball stadium. But it's nonetheless an audience. There's a particular group of people for whom this book is produced. Yes, can be used staff and faculty development workshops. Also the board retreats, also seminars for presidents. We presented a year plus ago to the presidents of the various Jesuit colleges and universities at the AJCU meeting. That's one use that this book has. All right, so that's enough from me, and Jennifer's going to talk about one of her contributions to the book.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Reed-Bouley. I'm grateful to Bill Purcell, Paula Muller, other conference organizers, panelists, and everyone here to celebrate the Catholic social tradition. It's a joy to present our work after more than 3 years developing the volume. Our book and this conference focus on how the Catholic social tradition can promote a more just, peaceful, and humane world. In the face of extreme polarization and significant social and economic instability, it is tempting to revert to technocratic models of leadership. But our panel analyzes a different model, that is, how a critical retrieval of CST can underpin decision-making about the operations of Catholic colleges and universities, CCUs. Today, we highlight the work of the 4 panelists gathered here. As an opener, I offer a snapshot of the chapter Beyond Patriarchy, Women's Leadership in Catholic Higher Education, which I co-authored with Catherine Punsalan-Manlimos of Seattle University, who unfortunately could not be here today. Catherine and I focus on how CST both serves as a foundation for important conversations about the operations of CCUs and how CST itself is in need of significant revision and development regarding women's full participation and leadership. Our use of the term women includes people with diverse backgrounds and identities which intersect with gender identity and influence how women are perceived and treated and the possibilities for their leadership. Here is a very compressed overview of the landscape for women's leadership in Catholic higher education. The ACCU reports that women are well represented among faculty and staff at member institutions. However, as you notice in the slide, women's representation decreases among the higher, more secure professional ranks. Regarding senior leadership, ACCU reports that in 2022, 32% of CCUs were led by women presidents. This was a 6% decrease from 2018. 21% of presidents were affiliated with religious orders, with approximately a third of these women, indicating the shift to lay leadership. The majority of CCU presidents are white, in their 60s, and married. The persistence of a predominantly white and increasingly male presidency runs contrary to the demographic changes among students regarding race, ethnicity, and gender. While the trend toward lay leadership reflects a move away from clericalism, it does not necessarily follow that women will continue to gain more presidential posts. With more than half of CCUs historically founded and led by women religious, the movement toward lay leadership has also led to more male presidents at these traditionally female-led institutions. Comparison of the Jesuit and Mercy networks is instructive. Transitions abound, but as of the time of this writing a week ago, there were 8 women presidents of the 28 members of the AJCU. Of the 20 male presidents, 5 are Jesuits. Among the lay presidents, 35% are women. 9 of the 17 presidents of member and associated Conference for Mercy higher education institutions are women. The upshot is that as lay presidential leadership rather than vowed religious leadership increases among CCUs, men are replacing women more quickly in traditionally women-led institutions than women are replacing men in traditionally men-led institutions. There are also significant salary disparities between women and men. These are noted in the slide here, indicating that the salary gap has decreased only a little more than 1% in over a decade. When we look to official CST on women, we find ambiguity. CST may ground the importance of attending to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in the recruitment, retention, and development of women who offer their gifts of leadership. At the same time, scholars have provided strong evidence that official CST has not been receptive to women's concern or participation. Though women suffer disproportionately from the social injustices regularly addressed in ecclesial teaching, for example, climate change, violence, immigration, work, and poverty, ecclesial teaching regularly treats these issues generally rather than as they impact women's lives specifically. When CST is considered more broadly, it is clear that women have contributed to shaping the tradition through scholarship and action. Women's contributions, however, have yet to be fully embraced, recognized, or sought. As previous speakers have noted, Pope Francis gives reasons for hope through his invitation to dialogue with those whose concerns are often ignored or invisible. Accordingly, Catherine and I suggest 3 of the most significant priorities regarding dialogue to advance justice toward women in CCUs. First, women continue to face significant barriers to the exercise of leadership related to the clerical and male cultures of many CCUs. In keeping with Pope Francis's invitation to dialogue, the voices that have been historically excluded from the discussions would need to take center stage. Second, most CCUs do not explicitly state in their missions that they aspire to be liberating forces for women. Capitalizing on women's gifts and talents requires strategic planning and processes for developing stronger networks for women in leadership, pipelines to support women who aspire to leadership, and ongoing formation of leaders. Third, as lay leadership of CCUs increases, all leaders require ongoing formation in the college or university's mission and identity. The religious formation and sense of leadership as a vocation that shaped members of religious orders cannot be replicated exactly. Accordingly, CCUs need to develop lay leaders of every and no faith tradition in spirituality, the Catholic intellectual tradition, Catholic social thought, and other topics that are essential for leadership in CCUs. We hope that our volume provides occasions to enter into these dialogues and to celebrate and develop CCU's institutional fidelity to CST. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass the baton to Laura Nichols on mission and admissions.
Hi, everyone. So first I want to thank Jennifer and Bernard. I'm Laura Nichols, sociologist at Santa Clara University, and they were really, of course, the inspiration for this volume, and as well as the co-authors. This was really something very positive to get to work on during the pandemic, and so I appreciate them sticking with us throughout that time period and seeing it to fruition. I also would like to thank the Hank Center at Loyola Chicago for allowing me to first present this chapter when it was in draft form. And thank you to all of you for allowing me this opportunity to come together around a topic that I suspect is near and dear to the hearts of many, if not all of us, especially those of us that work at Catholic colleges and universities. So in this chapter, I explore the influence of Catholic education in the United States, tracing the history of Catholic education since its inception. And I ask a lot of questions about what this history means for the students we enroll in our colleges and universities today. So I'll start briefly with the purpose of Catholic education at the founding of most of our Catholic colleges and universities, or CCUs. And then, as a sociologist, I really can't do anything without data, so I'll take a moment to show you some of the demographics that are included in the chapter. So at the height of Catholic education in the United States, more than half of Catholics attended a Catholic school at some point in their K-12 education. Of course, what helped was that many were free or low cost thanks to the availability of teachers from religious orders. Similarly, the founding missions of our Catholic colleges range from the earliest schools, created to provide training for religious, as well as to address discrimination against white immigrant Catholics, like a Boston paper that promoted being, quote, opposed to nunneries and the Jesuits. Catholic schools provided a crucial opportunity structure that resulted in social mobility for Catholics. The earliest Catholic schools had an impact on the development and formation of public schools in the United States as well. Catholic schools also dominated and have over time until recently, the private school market, especially elementary schools. Catholic K-12 schools made private education accessible to children in low and middle income families, which other private schools have not done. But while in the 1950s there were over 13,000 Catholic elementary and secondary schools, according to the National Catholic Educational Association, today there are just over 6,000. As Catholic elementary schools have closed, students from middle-class families have had less access to private schooling. As this chart reports, in millions, first we have the number of Catholics, which is each bar on the left-hand side, and then the number of children in Catholic schools for these two different time periods. In some, we have more Catholics, but fewer in Catholic schools. Economic sociologist Lisa Kester documents that as a group, white Catholics in the US experienced more rapid social class advancement than did those who were white and in other religions during the same time period. In one analysis, she studied young adults and found that while Catholic young adults started at more disadvantaged place in terms of the education levels of their parents and family income, they achieved greater mobility than those of other religions, leading to wealth accumulation. She notes that access to quality, affordable Catholic schools is likely one of the factors that explains this rapid wealth mobility of white Catholics in the United States. We know, though, that the fastest growth of Catholics in the US today are not white European American, but Latinx. Particularly notable is that 60% of Catholics under age 18 are Latinx, with 90% born in the United States. And I'm grateful for the work of Drs. Ospino and Wetzel O'Neill at Boston College, who have studied this topic. They note that there are over 8 million Catholic school-age children who are Latinx, however, less than 5% attend Catholic K-12 schools. The impact of this is also discussed in our volume in a chapter by Dr. Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado. So what does this mean for the students we enroll in our colleges? In the United States, our greatest number of prospective students are those who would be the first in their families to attend college. Fully 55% of all youth under the age of 18 in the US today have parents without a college degree. So these are our future college students. In previous research, I found that Catholic colleges as a group are more successful than other types of private colleges, as well as public four-year colleges, in graduating first-generation college students, as well as students who identify as Latinx. This is hopeful news. These are our future college students, and we have proven success in educating and graduating them. So how are we doing in enrolling students who would be the first in their families to go to college, as well as students who are born into families with limited economic resources? So to look at this, I pulled institutional data for all of our Catholic colleges and universities, all the four-year ones. And for today, I chose two groups to examine. And I'll just note that I am updating these data. So if anyone wants the most recent data about perhaps your CCU, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to share that information. So the first group we'll look at is the result if you Google top Catholic colleges in the US. You get this US News list of nationally ranked four-year Catholic colleges. You might recognize a couple of them. So for these colleges, I extracted data on the proportion of undergraduate students at our first-generation college, so not having a parent with at least some college, receive federal Pell Grants, and the percent of the 2018 class that were transfer students. So you'll note that these colleges have small proportions of their undergraduate student bodies that are first in their families to attend college, ranging from a low of 10% of the undergraduate student body to 25% at University of San Diego. In the US as a whole, about 34% of our undergraduates at all institutions are first-generation college. So looking at these data, we also see that these colleges are reproducing the inequality that has become so extreme in the United States today. We are enrolling students who already have educational and wealth privilege. In terms of income, while 39% of all college students in the US receive a Pell Grant, which is a measure of coming from a family with a very low income, our top-ranked schools have much lower proportion of students who receive such grants. These schools also have very low rates of enrolling transfer students, problematic because most first-generation college students start at two-year schools. So in contrast, the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities is tracking the closure of Catholic colleges. According to their record, since 2000, around 30 Catholic colleges have closed, and they're no longer providing undergraduate four-year degrees. They might be offering other types of programs, so many of them have restructured in different ways, but no longer offering undergraduate four-year bachelor's degrees. So this shows a partial list of some of the more recent. If we look at these schools, we see at the percentages of undergraduate students who are first in their families or receive Pell Grants are much larger than the 10 profiled in the previous table. At some schools, first-generation students are more than half of the undergraduate population. So what will happen to the students who previously would have gone to our now closed colleges? Are our more financially stable CCUs picking up the slack? Does Catholic social thought suggest a different way forward? I tentatively offer some ideas for consideration, starting with our strengths. So first, our Catholic schools have learned how to adapt, and we are still here, even if some of them are closing. When other religious colleges have lost their affiliations, our schools have still maintained their identities as Catholic schools, even while we might be arguing, examining, worrying about if we are Catholic enough. Second, we have something vital that is needed in U.S. higher education market at this moment. We have proven success at enrolling and providing a quality education, and we make sure that our students graduate. From our founding, we know how to do this for students who are first in their family to attend college, as well as students who are first or second generation immigrants to the US. Third, we have unifying ideals and missions that could bring us more strongly together as a network. And we could utilize this to fight market demand to individuate and instead come together and support one another. For example, there is growth in Catholic two-year colleges. How do we move students from them into our four-year schools, as a four-year degree is still necessary for stability and economic well-being? So in my estimation, we have an opportunity for more of our Catholic colleges to return to our earlier successes of providing opportunities for first and second generation immigrant students who have few educational opportunities today. As a result, we can once again contribute to community and individual well-being over the reproduction of wealth hoarding and advantage, and this could be more at the heart of all of our missions. Thank you. Next, we have Maureen O'Connell.
So I too want to express my thanks to Bernard and Jennifer for your assistance in guiding us through a very collaborative process, which for me was especially so because I got to draft and work through my article or my contribution with Dr. Tia Noel Pratt, who could not be with us today, but Tia is also a sociologist, so this was an interdisciplinary endeavor. She is at Villanova University. She is the Assistant Vice President for Strategic Initiatives in the Office of Mission. And you're gonna think that Laura and I had planned our talks given how I'm gonna open, but we didn't. In November of 2021, a couple months after we had already submitted all of the revisions on this essay, the Philadelphia Inquirer released a troubling story about the percentage of Black students enrolled in Philadelphia's robust higher education landscape. And since Tia and I were both products of the Catholic education system in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, both of us from elementary all the way through higher education, I found the data for the sample of 3 Catholic institutions that were lifted up in a graphic disturbing. Between 1995, the year I graduated from St. Joseph's University, so yes, I've just outed myself. This is a big milestone year for me. I'll say no more in terms of my age, but between 1995 and 2020, the number of Black students at St. Joseph's University, my alma mater, decreased from 9% to 6% of the student body. At Tia's current employer, Villanova University, on one of your charts there that you just shared, the percentage fell with, and arguably an institution with more resources to dedicate to enrolling and retaining Black students in that same time frame, really only increased their enrollment, but at 1995, 2% of the students at Villanova were Black. In 2020, that increased to 5%. The institution in Philadelphia, the Catholic institution in Philadelphia with the highest increase in Black enrollment was my own, Salle University, which went from 13% of Black students in 1995 to 18% in 2020. But again, I think what Laura just shared for you indicates that I'm not entirely enthusiastic about that jump, and not because I don't welcome those students, but I think it's really more a reflection of the market. Competitors like Temple University have slashed their rates of admittance of Black students. Temple in 1995 admitted 27% of Black students. In 2020, that was 14%. And then you pair that with the very low rates of retention that we have at my institution, particularly when it comes to Black students. And this suggests that this increase is really a result of market forces and not commitments to educational equity. So Tia and I mean, I wish we had that data because we would have put that in our essay. But we intended to write our essay to help those in positions of leadership make sense of this kind of information, and really to be able to understand the history behind this data, particularly the Catholic history behind those troubling statistics, as a critical first step. We need to understand the history first before moving to the urgent need to discern appropriate responses. And we intended the essay to assist those in Catholic higher education also in recognizing the unique role that we play in being, and I'm going to quote Dr. Becca from last evening, partners in realizing things like Catholic social thought and the human rights tradition, given our potential to unleash the creative, ethical, and practical interplay that Dr. Pratt and I saw between Catholic social thought and the Catholic intellectual tradition. Ours are institutions uniquely positioned to integrate these two things and unleash really dramatic social change. So to accomplish these goals in the essay, we brought an anti-racist stance or approach to racial inequality that attempts to dismantle systems and structures that perpetuate it. So how did we do that? First, we attempted to acknowledge that much like the concept of race itself, which is an ongoing project constantly being made and remade in the American experience, we identified how Catholic higher education is also a generational project and one that has long used the tool of race in that project. So to accomplish that, we started by mapping our own experiences in Catholic higher education in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, in different institutions and in different pathways to it, and to illuminate what we learned about our racial identities, as well as the Catholic churches and Catholic higher education's respective stances on forming us in those identities. So in reflecting on my experience, I named the way in which a white hegemonic approach to the intellectual canon and a faith that does service, but not necessarily justice, is one of the biggest reflections of the way in which Catholic higher education replicates whiteness from generation to generation. For her part, Tia lifted up the contrast experience she endured between being part of an unapologetically and very confident Black community growing up, the homogeneity of which stemmed from a history of residential segregation in the city of Philadelphia, and the Archdiocese's facilitation of that process, and contrasted that with the lack of evangelization among white Catholics about the very existence of Black Catholics, not to mention the gifts of Black Catholics that she experienced when she became a minority in Catholic communities of education, particularly higher education. And then we offered a historical case study about the refusal of my own institution, LaSalle University, to admit 2 Black students in 1937, and the agitation for the reversal of that university policy and practice as being, and this is the quote of our chapter, contrary to the tenets of Christian social justice on the part of the Federation of Colored Catholics. In this case study, it helped us define terms that are critical for what Tia likes to call, in all caps, the work of racial inclusion, terms like white supremacy, institutional racism, the difference between race relations, racial justice, and anti-racism, all terms that we think Catholic leadership in higher education need to understand. It also helped demonstrate the ways in which those historical practices, those historical choices and practices, reflect what scholars call the afterlife of slavery in the time that they were made, and perpetuated that afterlife for subsequent generations like our own, Tia and myself, and now for our students. We invite reflection on how Catholic institutions in many ways used anti-Blackness to make themselves, to claim and defend positions in an emerging marketplace of higher education, and how Catholic higher education is both a product of a culture of white supremacy and at the same time the producer of this same. And we offer some examples of how that's the case. The labor of enslaved peoples and racial capital that built so many institutions of higher education, the Catholic Church's participation in the racial segregation of suburbs, and therefore the segregation of Catholic schooling at every level, which created a pipeline for white-only admissions, as well as equity on homes and wealth that got accumulated by white families, but not by families of color. That same equity which becomes the tickets for white families into higher education as it becomes more and more expensive. The way in which elite institutions like Tia's Villanova are still less likely to admit Black applicants, and tuition-dependent and financially less secure institutions like my own might be doing that at higher rates, but not necessarily out of deeply held convictions in Catholic social teaching. So where does Catholic social teaching show up, you might wonder. So first, we try to name the dangerous, vicious cycle that our institutions can get trapped in when our approaches to Catholic social thought and the Catholic intellectual tradition are not attentive to the ways in which the white racial frame impacts both. And again, that harkens us to the critique of the loss of Catholic social teaching's innocence that Dr. Rebecca offered last evening. Catholic social teaching becomes performative, empty of relevance for many, and wounding through its hypocrisy others. And it becomes a means of protecting the comfort of many in our communities at the expense of those who are among minoritized populations. To move towards a more virtuous cycle in which Catholic social teaching and the Catholic intellectual tradition interact in ways to form both individual and collective minds and hearts, and to move collective bodies emotionally, intellectually, pragmatically, we recommend naming the inherent whiteness in our Catholic social teachings framework and the whiteness of its methods, its tendency to be cerebral and detached and formulaic and dogmatic and distanced and evaluative, always in the position of doing the evaluation, never being evaluated. And also to name that same dynamic in the canon of the Catholic intellectual tradition. A next step after that naming would be to privilege the ongoing development of both of these traditions, Catholic social teaching and the Catholic intellectual tradition, by scholars and practitioners and peoples of color, many of whom are calling for a deeper engagement with racism in the American Catholic Church than that offered by Open Wide Our Hearts, the bishop's most recent pastoral. Some of them are even arguing for a new principle for Catholic social teaching, a principle of racial justice. We envision Catholic universities as thought and action partners in that growing edge of the tradition, and being so bold as to bring the margins, the people closest to the pain, to the center via engagement with our bishops in writing a document that moves beyond race relations as a model of racial justice towards an anti-racist model. We also argue that we could expand the canon of our Catholic intellectual tradition, and in doing that, build the capacity for engaging with difference, with curiosity, empathy, accountability, and solidarity. In short, we think that there is no better institution equipped to do this really critical work than our own, but we need to do it with our eyes wide open. Thank you.
Let me add a third thanks to Bernard and Jennifer for convening us and for the group we worked together. I'm Vince Miller at the University of Dayton. My chapter was on sustainability in Catholic higher education. I'm going to pare down my comments to an argument I make about epistemology and Laudato Si, and what that has to do with the fundamental mission of Catholic higher ed. The challenge posed by the ecological and climate crises is frequently imagined in moral terms, just in the same way as Catholic social thought is frequently understood overwhelmingly in normative and moral terms. Catholic social thought, however, addresses much more than ethics. As the compendium explains, it also includes reflections on the nature of reality, ontology, the human person, anthropology, and society. Laudato Si expands Catholic social thought into matters of epistemology and forms of inquiry. It argues that the crises we face are not simply the result of moral failure, but failure of the dominant forms of thinking to properly understand the nature of reality and the human person. I argue that these epistemological dimensions of Laudato Si are particularly important for Catholic higher education. They can form the basis for engaging a much broader range of disciplines than a purely moral frame. To put it quite simply, if the argument is about simply morality and normative questions, vast swaths of the curriculum are really not part of that, right? Math doesn't bring much to the table, as moral as they may be. If it's about complexity and understanding complexity, then everyone has something to engage in, and there's a much broader dialogue. I begin by considering Laudato Si's diagnosis of the source of the environmental crisis in terms of its concept of the technocratic paradigm. I use that concept as a lens to evaluate contemporary Catholic higher education. The discussion then turns to integral ecology, which is Laudato Si's proposal for an alternative thought form. I pay particular attention to the encyclical's ontological and epistemological dimensions in addition to its ethical teaching. So, the technocratic paradigm in a second. Francis describes the technocratic paradigm as an epistemology and a way of thinking. It functions as an epistemological paradigm, in his words, that generalizes, quote, the method and aims of science and technology in a way that shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. That is, it tends to view human moral and cultural problems as adequately understood by the methods of the natural sciences. The specialization and fragmentation, and this is key, of technical knowledge is the source of their great practical power. They get things done. But this specialization makes it difficult, quote, to see the larger picture and can lead to a loss of appreciation for the whole, and especially for the relationship between things. The response in the encyclical is integral ecology, which is a constructive alternative to the technocratic paradigm and positioned as such. It encompasses an ontological understanding of the nature of reality as relationship, an epistemology that cultivates attentiveness to those relationships, and finally, a normative moral evaluation of creation and its manifold relationships. When considered from this multidimensional perspective, its relevance, it's enormously relevant to the curricular and institutional dimensions of Catholic higher education. This vision of interrelatedness of creation is grounded in its triune creator. I argue that paragraph 240, which I'm not going to read to you because I'm going to try to yield some time back to our group, argues, it shows how creation is rooted in the relationality of the triune creator. It calls for attentiveness to those relationships, and then it calls for loving nurturance of those relationships. We humans do not simply notice those interrelations in the world around us, we participate in them socially and ecologically. We learn from the triune God and the created world that reflects that God that our fulfillment and indeed our sanctification, in the terms of the encyclical, are found not in isolation, but in embracing and deepening relationship through human solidarity and care for creation. All of this resonates deeply with what Monica Hellwig called the Catholic intellectual tradition's attention to the community dimension of all behavior, or to use the words of the compendium, the constitutive social dimension of human beings. I want to focus in particular on the epistemological dimensions of this. These beliefs about God and the nature of creation inspire a way of seeing, a certain kind of gaze that serves as an alternative to the technocratic paradigm by seeking to perceive the interconnections in creation. In Francis's understanding, this epistemological alternative is of a piece with his spiritual and theological commitments. Francis speaks of an attitude of heart, which approaches life with serene attentiveness,
which is capable of being fully present to someone. And as you know from the encyclical, there are extensive reflections on how Jesus embodies this and how Francis follows in those footsteps. St. Francis follows in those footsteps in important ways. Personal anecdote, I've been working for several years with scientists at an experimental forest in Oregon, and this relationship began shortly after the publication of Laudato Si. One of the scientists, geologists, asked about the encyclical, and I shared this passage and some others with him. He's a very profound person, but as near as I can tell, he is not a person of faith in any way. After reading these segments from Laudato Si, he responded enthusiastically, and he's a very quiet scientist, but he said, yes, that's what I want to bring to the forest, a gaze of serene attentiveness. And he put exclamation points in his email, right? This was everything he was trying to do with his life, right? These were the words that he didn't have. So everything around us has these interconnections within us, right? And all the disciplines cultivate some form of attentiveness to a portion of creation. There's real potential there for thinking about Catholic higher education in these terms. Because its moral dimensions are founded upon substantial ontological and epistemological components, Catholic social thought cannot be adequately addressed with a few ethics or moral theology requirements. Integral ecology calls for, and here's what I think is key, can provide the basis for a broad and inclusive interdisciplinary dialogue to understand and address the ecological crisis. Integral ecology's understanding of the relational character of reality provides the possibility for engagement with just about every discipline, beginning with a critical conversation about the principles and methods they employ. While many disciplines may not provide much basis for participating in moral debates about the environmental crisis, as I said, mathematics, all presume an implicit or explicit construction of reality. Certainly mathematics, along with disciplines from anthropology and finance to mechanical engineering history, have distinct postulates concerning the nature of reality and of its complexity. Ethical discussions can leave those interpretations of reality both unengaged and unchallenged. Admittedly, Laudato Si's critique of the technocratic paradigm is rather shallow and needs to be deepened much more in dialogue. The same holds especially, though, I think, for education with the epistemological aspects of integral ecology. Each discipline has its own methods for what counts as data or evidence and methods for interpreting, analyzing, and employing them. A large part of what we do, a large part of both undergraduate and graduate education is training students to work within such epistemological frameworks. Consider the historian's concern for proper use of sources and hesitance to narrate beyond what they warrant, the mathematician's concern for conceptual and logical clarity, and the specific skills necessary for acquiring and interpreting data in the various natural sciences. Each discipline cultivates attentiveness consistent with its understanding of reality. Transdisciplinary conversation about these forms of attentiveness could contribute much to developing an ethos of attentiveness called for by integral ecology. Laudato Si, like the tradition of CST to which it belongs, offers much to Catholic higher education. Its relevance is both enhanced by attending to not just their normative moral teachings, but also their ontological, anthropological, and epistemological dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. My name's Joe McCartin. I'm from Georgetown University. I'm also grateful to Bernard and Jennifer for for inviting me to be part of their wonderful volume. So my contribution to the book concerns, as you can see in the title, labor relations. In my experience, labor relations is often one of the most sensitive issues we can address because it involves questions of power, of employers, of workers, and the distribution of power between them. It's sensitive, but it's nonetheless central. The labor question was at the heart of the emergence of modern Catholic social tradition. The labor question, as I think everybody here knows, gave rise to Rerum Novarum, and the labor question helped propel forward all of the teaching that followed, all the teaching we're here to celebrate. It remains central in our time, in my view, but its practice In practice, its centrality, I think, has been compromised over time. It became more marginal in the last decades of the 20th century, I think, and in the early part of the 21st. And its marginalization has been costly, I would argue, especially when it comes to the practices of our institutions of higher ed. For it's been there that this marginalization has been, I think, quite visible. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it appears that many of our institutions of higher ed have tried to insulate themselves from their own teachings on labor. In the era of Pope Francis, I detect some change on that score. And there have been important steps forward in recent years by many of our institutions. Maybe we can discuss later. But overall, I think we've not risen to the challenge of applying our own teachings on labor to our own institutions. Until we do, I think we compromise everything we try to teach about this larger social tradition. So this is the point I try to make in my chapter. I'll just really run through very briefly what I say. I start by noting that in the era of the emergence of Catholic higher ed, the Land O'Lakes Conference convened by Father Hesburgh, the question of labor wasn't really on the table. If you look at the Land O'Lakes document, it talked about, it didn't mention the words labor worker at all, but talked about appropriate participation by all members of the community, for example. Basic reorganizations of structure to foster greater internal cooperation and participation. This was as close as it came to addressing what we might call the labor question. Yet that was understandable in an era where labor issues as such hadn't yet really emerged in a concrete way on most of our campuses. They hadn't emerged in part because of the context of that time. Growing enrollments, our institutions were growing. They were helping to connect to a rising middle and working class. They had a lot of federal support. They also had a reliable source of labor that was a long-term labor source. In this favorable context, you know, the vagueness around Land O'Lakes was suitable. There were some labor conflicts in the late 60s and early 70s, but very few, and mostly they were settled with in cases when professors tried to form unions, for example, at places like St. John's, with the university maybe fighting a bit, but then even accepting it. However, that context changed radically, I point out, between the mid-70s and the Great Recession. Our whole economy went through an enormous change that changed our institutions. Our boards became increasingly dominated not just by business members, but by members of the financial community. There was growing internal wage inequality in our institutions. We began to subcontract services, hire part-time faculty, adjuncts, et cetera, and to resist unionization. These changes created a situation of growing tension, especially in the post-Great Recession era, when the labor question really began to heat up. And that you could really see coming to the fore when the pandemic struck, and in many of our places, the labor question really emerged with a vengeance. Programs ended in some places, people laid off, et cetera. You could no longer really ignore the emergence of this question. In some ways, I think the pandemic era was a wake-up call for us that should summon us to deal with this growing problem over time. There was a range of responses to the Great Recession that I'll skip over there. One of the things, or to the pandemic, one of the things that did emerge from the pandemic was, for the first time, workers across multiple institutions coming together to demand change. The emergence of things like the Coalition of Jesuit Higher Ed Workers and Students, for example. They really have put the question on the table for us. I think it's a question we cannot ignore. I think it's one we can improve on by drawing on our own tradition. Here I just cite some of the things I explore in the book of some of the recent and positive developments that have emerged. One of them represented by work going on here at Notre Dame, led by Professor Dan Graff, Notre Dame's Just Wage Group. I won't go into these right now, except to say that there are hopeful signs that we're beginning to grapple with this question now for the first time. I say a lot more in there. I'll pause, though, just to be that brief. And simply conclude by saying that until we deal with the labor question in a really forthright way in our institutions, I think we're really not going to realize the full deep promise of the social tradition that's celebrated in this book and in this conference. And so I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
We have, I think, 9 minutes. Bill has an announcement to make before we need to leave here at 5. So I think I'm moderating the discussion, kind of, sort of. So if people have questions to ask a particular speaker, please raise your hand if you want to ask questions about the project as a whole. And yeah, I think you have to go to the mic.
Sorry, I'm a sociologist. I ask provocative questions. I wanted to ask, in all of the panelists' reporting, it was about the nature of Catholic institutions with these data. And I kept asking, how does it compare to non-Catholic institutions, especially in light of Catholic social thought? So my question is there anything qualitatively different on any of the areas you worked on, right? In terms of the representation and inclusion of women, in terms of social mobility versus social reproduction of elites, in terms of racial inclusion and integration, or the promotion of success once we've received access, right? Students are there. Like you talked about the, hard to keep students in, especially students of color. In terms of promoting critical thinking or constructive or civic mindedness rather than just credentialing, right? In a range, or in terms of labor markets, how we treat adjuncts, how we treat, cost of living increases for faculty. Like, I'm very curious, was there a qualitative difference looking at Catholic institutions versus non-Catholic?
All right, that's a question for the other panelists. So, Laura definitely can speak to that, and I
Sure,
think
well,
Maureen, you can too.
Yeah, I'll just start. First of all, our Catholic institutions do a better job of graduating first-generation college students as a whole. If we group, all of our Catholic four-year schools along with public institutions and other private institutions. Yeah, no worries. I could see sociologist. I can see you. So that's one area. I guess I didn't do comparison with other types of institutions on every measure that I looked at. I think given that, our public institutions do better of bringing in Pell students, and of course that varies depending on how much public support there is in various states at that time. I guess what I do though is say we should be doing more, and what it seems like is that our institutions, at least the top 10, to get into the top 10, they've looked to, the elite institutions that are not Catholic institutions and kind of looked there and have oriented kind of measures of success towards them, comparing to other institutions. We talk about Stanford a lot at, Santa Clara University in the Bay Area. So that's the piece where I think I raised some questions about, but is that really what we're about? And do we need to keep doing that, or are there other, does CST help us say, hey, stop the train, we're about being a community, and how can we actually orient our view in other places?
I'll quick, I don't think this one is on there. To your good question, Josh, I think I would just briefly say Dr. Pratt, Tia Pratt, and myself in separate research talk about the way in which faith formation and racial formation in the Catholic experience in the United States go hand in hand. And so that would make it, I think, quite different. And the roles that our institutions of higher education play in calcifying that ongoing racial formation, I think, is quite distinct.
I can quickly speak to the labor question. Some Catholic institutions have really played a leading role, I think, in trying to come up with better solutions. I'm proud of Georgetown for having, in 2005, created a just employment policy that Kathleen Maasweiger helped to put together, along with others, which set a living wage, and also recognized that workers had a right to organize and collectively bargain, whether they were directly employed by the university or, very importantly, by our contractors. And as Kathleen could tell you, Catholic vision was very much part of that, and it has been copied by some other institutions to varying extents. So there are ways in which the Catholic culture has made a difference in particular settings.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Bouncing off that point, actually, and to your discussion of labor at Georgetown, but for all the panelists, really, I'm Dom. I'm a grad student, and it's interesting hearing this discussion around labor and access and sort of that odd liminal space of being a grad student in the modern moment, particularly at Catholic institutions. We were having some interesting discussion amongst grad students and graduate assistants among several different institutions over text and over things the past few months, watching the situation at Temple University. I don't know if people have been following that. I believe at Temple, a public land grant institution. And it's tough, right? Because you've seen various attempts to organize amongst grad students, amongst adjuncts at Catholic spaces, as you touched on in recent years. Different schools have responded in ways. And Dr. O'Connell, you're speaking. Your research also made me think hard about this next generation of folks who are coming up into the academy, wanting to make a difference and wanting to enter in these research spaces. In terms of access, in terms of privilege, and the getting to a space where you can even attempt to do that in a realistic manner, we're at the real generational turning point right now, it seems, as someone who's only been a master's GA for a few years. So I know we could go a lot of different directions, but do any of you see any potential hinge points or places of conversational or dialogue or even tough conversational entry amongst our U.S. Catholic higher educational landscape in these next 3 to 5 years? Particularly it hasn't come up as a specific issue that as I'm aware of in the U.S. synodal documents coming out of these conversations, but do you see any openings there? Because it's kind of dire, it would seem to be in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. Right before dinner, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I could turn this on, but it would take too long. I share your concerning outlook. I do think we are in a bit of a crisis point, and I think the question is how to take a crisis point and turn it into a kairos moment. And I know I can sound a bit Pollyannish about this, but I do think the Synod is the place to do that. And I've been having some initial conversations with folks about, well, what would a synodal gathering for higher education look like? And what would the conversations that we would want to have amongst ourselves include? And who would we want to be in dialogue with in that? Who would we want to bring into that room? How would we go about determining what would be the things that we would communally discern around something like that? So I do think that that's the Pope's vision for trying to be synodal anyway, is to figure out how to be a deeply relational church that journeys together, particularly through challenging times. And I think we just need to expand the imagination in higher education for something like that and begin to think a little bit more collaboratively. We've competed with one another, and in Philadelphia, we've done that to the detriment of most of the institutions in the city of Philadelphia. There's 11 of us. I think we need to start to think more collaboratively, more in terms of solidarity, more in terms of subsidiarity. So others might have something to chime in.
I would just really quickly say amen to that. And that was one of the things I found was so exciting about that Jesuit coalition of workers and students, because it was an effort to build solidarity across campuses. I think we need to do that, not just in Jesuit world, but just broadly. If we're going to really deal with the structural problems that beset higher ed in general.
We have time for one more question, if we have one more question. If not, so be it.
There's more time over there on the left.
Yeah, I know. Which one you go with? So before you come here, Bill, I do want to just recognize one more contributor to the book who's not on the stage, namely Father Paul Coleman, who wrote our chapter 10 on Catholic higher education and Catholic social thought in a global context. So thanks, Paul.
Again, we want to thank this panel. They've done a lot of work, and it's great to have them all here so we can